The Liberals, as you would have heard, have chosen to oppose the Indigenous Voice, an historic constitutional initiative going to a referendum later this year. The Liberals' decision to join the Nationals so that the coalition opposes the Indigenous Voice outright, campaigning for the no case in the referendum, this will reverberate for the rest of the year and possibly for many years to come. Here's how Peter Dutton characterised the decision.
The Liberal Party resolved today to say yes to constitutional recognition for Indigenous Australians, yes to a local and regional body so that we can get practical outcomes for Indigenous people on the ground. But there was a resounding no to the Prime Minister's Canberra Voice. It should be very clear to Australians by now that the Prime Minister is dividing our country and the Liberal Party seeks to unite our country.
Well, it's a no. There are no yeses in that response. The Liberals said yes to constitutional recognition years ago. It was in a preamble put to a referendum in 1999. It's been backed by all parties since then. John Howard even revved it up again in 2007, so that's nothing new. That's not progress. Likewise, the position on local and regional voices. It's not new. The coalition committed to that back when it was in government. It did all the work on a model. They even had me on a committee helping with that work. So the only issue up for decision now is whether to support enshrining the voice in the Constitution. That is, recognise Indigenous Australians in the Constitution the way that Indigenous people, after years of consultation, have said they want to be recognised. This is the only recognition on offer. This is the only voice on offer, and the Liberals have now decided to join the Nationals and say no. N-O, no. This comes on the very day that news polls shows the Voice has more than 50% support in 5 out of our 6 states. And in Queensland, it's 49% anyway, with 8% undecided. Nationally, the vote is 54% to 38%, with 8% undecided. So a vote now would see the Voice win, majority of states, majority of people. And if you split the undecideds evenly, you get an even more solid win, with all the states winning, the yes winning right across the country. And there's been very little yes campaigning so far and lots of quite hysterical attacks on the Voice. So there is a chance, even with the history of referenda in this country, that even with coalition opposition, this referendum could get up. Support for the Voice could even build from here. We'll have to wait and see. Peter Dutton calls this the Canberra Voice and claims it will be filled by academics. But he knows the idea is for Indigenous people to choose their own representatives, grassroots representatives. Instead of getting on board and attempting to ensure this body is well formulated, that it does spring from the grassroots, the Liberals now just want to bring it down.
The onus is on the government to demonstrate how Anthony Albanese's Voice proposal can improve the lives of Indigenous Australians without dividing all Australians.
Well, no, it's not the Prime Minister's Voice. The idea and the consensus came from Indigenous Australians working with constitutional conservatives. The Liberals know that. So they can play with the rhetoric all they like, but by opposing this, the Liberals are not denying Labor, they are denying the aspirations of the overwhelming majority of Indigenous Australians. When the 1967 referendum gave Canberra responsibility for Indigenous affairs, there was no case. The country just united behind this reform. Yet now, with this move to give Indigenous people a say on how Canberra should exercise those powers, we're going to have a highly partisan, emotive campaign battle. On the no side, we'll see hardliners run a far-fetched scare campaign, and on the yes side, the hardliners will display sanctimony and cry racism against their opponents. I dread this debate. We know some Liberal MPs will dissent and they'll campaign for the yes case. And one Nationals MP has already quit the party over support for the Voice.
I think, my honest assessment after the contributions across the 3 meetings we've had this morning, there might be 3 or 4 people on the backbench who will want to advocate a yes position or campaign for and within our party, that's within the limits.
Well, as the debate plays out, you can expect more dissenters. The coalition parties could fracture over this. But more to the point, the country could divide. This is not the sort of partisan debate we need. This is not supposed to be about race. It's supposed to be about justice and fairness for the descendants of our First Peoples. But opponents decry it as race-based. They invoke apartheid. They allege special privileges. They tell people that our very system of government is under threat. The crazy reality is that everyone in the debate agrees Indigenous people need to have more of a say on the issues affecting them. Nobody in this country even pretends that what we've been doing in Indigenous affairs has been working. The whole closing the gap agenda proves our failures. And nobody pretends the voice is a silver bullet. But it is a way to give Indigenous people a fair go and some responsibility for better outcomes. Yet Dutton and others say they reject it because it won't work. On the one hand, they say they don't know what it is. On the other, they say it won't work. On the one hand, they say they support a legislated voice. On the other, they say that a voice legislated under a constitutional clause will not work. It's just inconsistent and indefensible. The coalition is saying they will try to block a new approach because it won't work, even though they know we are failing now, with lives being wasted and communities descending into crisis. So it's better to do nothing? To block a long-considered, hard-won reform because why? Because critics argue there is a risk that at some point in the future, some Indigenous person or group will challenge some law or decision in the High Court citing the voice clauses. Really? This is not a serious argument, especially given the considered opinions we've heard from so many constitutional law experts. This is political fear-mongering, cold, hard, partisan politics, shutting the door on hard-won Indigenous aspirations. This will get harder for the coalition. Imagine the arguments their MPs are being asked to run now, that they support an Indigenous voice, which should be legislated, and they support Indigenous recognition in the Constitution, but not this voice and not this recognition. And though it's come from widespread, even though it's come from widespread and long-term consultation with Indigenous people. Now, the coalition are either claiming this is just too hard for us to do, that it's beyond the wit of this nation to do it properly, or that it's just not worth doing. It has to be one or the other, and neither of those arguments stacks up, do they? And federal Liberal MPs will argue this while some of their colleagues argue the opposite, and importantly, while most of their state Liberal colleagues, including the Tasmanian Premier and the other state leaders, will also argue for the yes case. They will come across as a confused rabble. On the night this referendum does go to a vote later this year, there will be a wake of one sort or another in this country. If the referendum wins despite coalition opposition, much of the country will celebrate, but there will be a wake for the coalition because it will have killed itself off as irrelevant for a decade or more. If the referendum fails, and it can only fail narrowly, we'll be having a wake for national unity, as the country will be hopelessly divided over the central national project of reconciliation, which will be set back for a generation. Poor fellow my country.